The air in the new Agri-King dealership hung thick and sterile, a chemical cocktail of fresh paint, vulcanized rubber, and the faint, cloying scent of pine-scented floor cleaner. It was the smell of money, the kind of money that didn't come from dirt under the fingernails. Gleaming under the long fluorescent lights were the Titans of 1978, a brand-new International Harvester, 1586, its red paint so deep you could drown in it, tires taller than a man, the cab a glass-walled sanctuary with a cushioned seat and a factory-installed 8-track player. Next to it, a massive axial flow 1460 combine sat like a patient predator, its header a grinning row of silver teeth. Into this temple of modern agriculture walked Earl Miller. He didn't stride in. He moved with the slow, deliberate economy of a man who measured his life in seasons, not quarters. His overalls, worn soft as flannel at the knees and thighs, were a road map of his work, with faint constellations of grease, a smear of hydraulic fluid on the bib, and the honest dust of a 100-acre field clinging to the cuffs. His boots were scuffed and cracked, the leather permanently shaped to his feet. A faded pioneer seed cap sat low on his brow, shadowing a face carved by sun and wind. He was 54 years old, but his eyes, clear and blue as a winter sky, held the sharp, assessing gaze of a man who missed nothing. He wasn't here for the new iron. He was on a scavenger hunt. The clutch linkage on his old Farmall M had finally given up the ghost, a pin shearing clean off after 40 years of faithful service. He needed a specific clevis pin and cotter key, and he hoped they might have one in an old bin in the back, a leftover from the days when this dealership was just a greasy one-bay shop run by old man Abernathy. At the center of the showroom, under the biggest IH sign, stood Stan, the dealership manager. Stan was a man whose own hands hadn't seen a wrench in a decade. He wore a short-sleeved polyester shirt, a tie cinched a little too tight, and a smile that never quite reached his eyes. He was leaning against the front tire of the 1586, deep in conversation with Richard Peterson. Richard, or Rich, as he insisted everyone call him, was everything Earl was not. He was 32, with a full head of blow-dried hair and a physique softened by a life spent in air-conditioned cabs. He wore crisp, new blue jeans, polished cowboy boots, and a pearl snap shirt. He'd inherited his father's 300 acres 5 years ago, and, through the magic of bank loans and government programs, had already expanded to over 1,000. He was the poster boy for the new way of farming: leverage, expand, get big or get out. And the beauty of this new financing, Rich, Stan was saying, his voice oozing salesmanship, is we can roll your 1066 trade-in value right into it. The bank sees land values going up, corn prices staying strong. They're practically giving money away. You could have this beauty in your shed by Friday, be the first in the county with the new series. Rich hooked his thumbs in his belt. I don't know, Stan. It's a lot of tractor. The payment on that and the new combine. Think of it as an investment in efficiency, Stan countered smoothly. How many hours did you spend fixing that old planter last spring? Time is money, Rich. With a new rig like this, you're not just buying horsepower, you're buying uptime. You'll cover more ground, faster. You can pick up another 80 acres to rent with the time you save. Earl stood by the parts counter, waiting. The kid behind the desk, a teenager with a wispy mustache, was on the phone, talking to his girlfriend about a movie. Earl could hear the whole conversation. He cleared his throat. The kid ignored him. He looked back at the scene in the showroom. Rich was now climbing up into the cab of the 1586. He settled into the plush seat, his hands gliding over the controls as if he were piloting a starship. Stan stood on the steps, pointing out the features, his voice a low, urgent murmur. They were two men speaking a language Earl understood but refused to learn, the language of monthly payments, interest rates, and perpetual debt. To Earl, a tractor was a tool you owned, a partner in the soil. To them, it was a line item on a balance sheet, a temporary asset held at the mercy of a banker in a faraway city. Earl's own fleet was a working museum. His main tillage tractor was a John Deere 4020, the diesel engine, a symphony of controlled power he knew by heart. For planting, he still used the Farmall M he'd bought with his father after the war, its engine rebuilt twice by his own hands. His combine was a Massey Ferguson 510, a machine most farmers had already sent to the scrapyard. But they were his. Every bolt, every bearing, every drop of oil in them belonged to him, and him alone. When they broke, he fixed them. He owed no man a single dime on any of it. He cleared his throat again, louder this time. The kid at the counter finally hung up the phone, rolling his eyes. "Yeah? What can I get for you?" "Looking for a clutch linkage clevis pin for a 39 Farmall M," Earl said, his voice quiet but clear. The kid stared at him blankly. "A what for a what?" "Farmall M," Earl repeated patiently. "It's an older tractor." The kid snorted. "Yeah, no kidding. We don't carry parts for junk like that anymore. Maybe try the scrapyard." He gestured vaguely with his thumb toward the back door before turning his attention to a stack of invoices, dismissing Earl completely. A slow anger, cold and heavy, began to build in Earl's chest. It wasn't just the kid's disrespect. It was the whole place. The shiny, soulless machines. The talk of endless credit. The condescending assumption that anything old was worthless. He looked over at Rich Peterson, who had now caught his eye from the cab of the new tractor. Rich gave him a small, pitying smirk, a look that said, "Look at you, old man, with your broken-down junk, while I'm sitting here on top of the world." That was it. That was the moment something shifted in Earl. He had come here for a $5 part, a humble supplicant asking for a piece to keep his old world turning. But in that instant, seeing the smug look on Rich Peterson's face and the dismissive wave of the parts kid, he saw the future they were all building, a future built on a foundation of debt as unstable as sand. And he wanted no part of it. But he also knew a day of reckoning was coming. For all of them. He turned without a word and walked toward the big glass doors. As his hand touched the handle, Stan finally noticed him. "Hey there, Earl. Didn't see you come in," he called out, his voice slick with false bonhomie. "Anything I can help you with today? Thinking of trading in that old Deere of yours? We're offering top dollar on trades right now." Earl stopped and turned slowly. He looked past Stan, past the gleaming red tractor, and met Rich Peterson's gaze through the pristine cab glass. He held it for a long moment. He didn't say a word. Then he looked at Stan. "No, thank you, Stan," he said, his voice level. "I don't believe you have anything I need." He pushed the door open and stepped out into the bright, hot afternoon sun. The smell of honest dirt and diesel fumes from his old Ford pickup a welcome relief. He had come for a pin and left with a purpose. They saw a man in dirty overalls. They had no idea who he really was or what he was capable of. Before we go any further into Earl's story, I've got to ask you folks watching this. Have you ever been in a situation like that? Judged by the truck you drove or the clothes you wore? Written off before you even opened your mouth? Let me know down in the comments if you've ever had the satisfaction of proving people like that dead wrong. Because what happened next in Earl's life was a masterclass in just that. Earl drove the 10 miles home with the truck windows down, the wind whipping through the cab. The failed trip to the dealership wasn't a defeat. It was a clarification. It solidified a resolve that had been hardening in him for years. He pulled into his long gravel driveway, past the modest white farmhouse where he'd been born, and parked the truck beside his workshop. The shop was Earl's sanctuary. It was a long, pole-frame building he'd put up himself 20 years prior. It wasn't pretty, but it was perfect. The air inside was a familiar perfume of cold steel, motor oil, and the sharp tang of the welding flux. Along one wall stood a heavy-duty workbench made from 2-inch thick oak planks, stained dark with the ghosts of 1,000 projects. A massive vise was bolted to one corner, its jaws scarred from years of clamping, bending, and persuading stubborn metal. Above it, tools hung in a meticulous order that only he understood. Wrenches sorted by size, screwdrivers by type, hammers by weight. In the corner stood a hulking, army-green Lincoln arc welder from the 1950s, a machine with no delicate circuitry, just raw, dependable power. He walked over to the crippled Farmall M. It sat there in the center of the concrete floor, its narrow front end and simple, exposed engine a testament to a different era of design. It wasn't a machine you operated from a sealed glass box. It was a machine you wore, a machine you felt through the soles of your boots and the palms of your hands. He knelt and looked at the broken linkage. The small metal clevis had snapped at its weakest point, right at the hole for the pin. A simple piece of cast metal, but without it, the tractor was useless. "Scrapyard," the kid had said. Earl spat on the floor. He wasn't driving 30 miles to a junkyard to root through a pile of rust on the off chance he'd find the right part. He was going to make one. He went to the steel rack at the back of the shop, a collection of flat bars, round stock, and angle iron he'd accumulated over the years. Nothing went to waste on Earl's farm. A broken piece of a disc harrow frame could become a brace for a gate. A worn-out plowshare could be forged into a new tool. He selected a piece of 1/2-inch thick, flat bar, its surface covered in a light layer of mill scale. He carried it to the workbench, clamped it in the vise, and picked up a hacksaw. For the next 2 hours, the only sounds in the shop were the rhythmic rasp of the saw blade biting into steel, the screech of the drill press as he bored the holes, and the sharp, rhythmic tap-tap-tap of his hammer as he shaped the metal. He worked with an unhurried precision, his calloused hands moving with a certainty that came from a lifetime of repair. He didn't need blueprints. The design was in his head, a perfect 3-dimensional image of the part he needed. He ground the edges smooth on the bench grinder, sending a shower of orange sparks into the dimming light. He heated the new piece with an oxyacetylene torch until it glowed cherry red, then bent it carefully in the vise to create the U-shape of the clevis. He let it cool slowly, annealing the steel to give it strength without brittleness. Finally, he test-fit it on the clutch rod. It was perfect. A little rougher than the original cast part, but 10 times stronger. He greased it, slid a new hardened bolt through the hole to act as the pin, and secured it with a lock washer and nut. He climbed onto the steel seat of the Farmall, pulled the choke, and hit the starter. The engine coughed once, twice, then roared to life with a satisfyingly deep, uneven rumble that vibrated through the whole building. He pushed the clutch pedal. It felt solid, firm. He put the tractor in gear and eased it out of the shop, the problem solved not with a credit card, but with skill, sweat, and a 50-cent piece of scrap steel. As the sun began to set, painting the western sky in shades of orange and purple, the contrast with his neighbor became starkly clear. From his yard, Earl could see the far corner of Rich Peterson's property. A brand-new set of halogen lights, mounted on a tall pole, blazed to life, illuminating Rich's massive machine shed and the sprawling gravel lot in front of it. The faint, high-pitched whine of a modern turbo-diesel engine carried on the evening air. Rich was likely working late, but not with a wrench. He was probably on the phone with the grain elevator, or a seed salesman, or his banker. His work was about numbers. Earl's was about nuts and bolts. The community noticed the difference too. At the farmers' co-op elevator, the morning gathering spot for coffee and gossip, Earl became a sort of cautionary tale. Saw Earl Miller out cultivating with that old M of his yesterday, one of the younger farmers would say, shaking his head. In this heat. Can't believe he doesn't have a tractor with a cab yet. Heard he tried to buy a part for it over at the new IH place, another would add with a chuckle. They practically laughed him out of there. Rich Peterson would usually be there, leaning against a pallet of feed sacks, holding court. It's a shame, he'd say, striking a tone of false sympathy. The man's a hard worker. Nobody denies that. But you can't fight progress. He's working himself into an early grave trying to keep that junk running. My dad always said, you got to spend money to make money. Earl never did learn that lesson. They saw Earl's frugality as a failure of ambition. They saw his weathered equipment as a sign of poverty, not of independence. They didn't see the long nights in the shop, the ingenuity that kept it all running. They didn't see that while their net worth was tied up in bank notes and depreciation schedules, Earl's was in the rich, black soil he owned outright and the tangible steel in his shed. He was a ghost from a past they were all desperate to outrun, a reminder of a time when farming was about survival, not speculation. The scorn didn't bother him, but the foolishness did. They were like men in a boat, drilling holes in the bottom to bail the water out faster. The harvest of '78 was a trial by fire. A week of perfect dry weather was forecast, a golden window to get the corn in. Earl fired up the old Massey 510 combine, its gasoline engine rumbling to life. On the second day, just as he was finishing a pass on the back 40, he heard a loud bang, followed by the sickening sound of grinding metal. He shut it down immediately. The main drive chain for the separator had snapped, whipping around and shattering the cast-iron housing for the tensioner sprocket. It was a catastrophic failure. A part like that hadn't been made in 15 years. The dealership wouldn't have it. The scrapyard was a long shot. A storm was now forecast for the end of the week. He had 3 days. That night, under the bare bulb of a single work light hanging from the combine's grain auger, Earl went to work. His wife, Martha, a woman as quiet and resilient as he was, brought him a thermos of black coffee and a plate of sandwiches. She didn't ask if he could fix it. She just stood with him for a moment, her hand on his shoulder, a silent vote of confidence that was worth more than all the bank credit in the world. He couldn't replace the housing, but he could bypass it. He spent the first night disassembling the entire drive system, his hands and arms covered in a thick paste of grease and chaff. The next day, he drove into town to a machine shop and bought a length of heavy-duty roller chain and 2 new sprockets. He spent that entire day and most of the second night re-engineering the drive. He cut and welded new mounting brackets, changed the gear ratios, and fabricated a new tensioner system from a heavy-duty spring and a piece of threaded rod. It was a greasy, frustrating, back-breaking job. Twice he nearly gave up, the sheer exhaustion threatening to overwhelm him. But the image of Rich Peterson's smug face and the thought of his crop rotting in the field kept him going. On the morning of the 3rd day, as the sky to the west began to bruise with the color of the coming storm, he finally finished. He climbed into the operator's seat, took a deep breath, and turned the key. The engine fired, and with a prayer, he engaged the separator. Instead of a grinding crash, there was a smooth, powerful whir. It worked. He managed to get the last of the corn in just as the first drops of rain began to fall, speckling the dust on the combine's windshield. He had won, but it had taken nearly everything he had. The next few years were a blur of prosperity, a golden age for American agriculture. The grain embargo against the Soviet Union was lifted, and commodity prices shot to the moon. Corn was over $3 a bushel. Land that had been selling for $700 an acre was suddenly worth $2,000, then $3,000. The banks, flush with petrodollars from the Middle East, were lending money with an almost frantic desperation. The message from the government, from the universities, from the farm magazines, was singular and deafening. Expand. Rich Peterson became the local embodiment of that philosophy. He was no longer just a farmer, he was an agri-businessman. He bought another 200 acres at a record price, financing 100% of the purchase. He traded in his nearly new 1586 for a massive articulated Steiger Panther, a four-wheel drive monster that could pull a 30-foot chisel plow. He built a new ranch-style house for his family, set far back from the road, with a two-car garage and a satellite dish in the yard. He built another, bigger machine shed, a gleaming steel structure that dwarfed Earl's humble workshop. He was hailed as a visionary, a man with the courage to seize the opportunities of the modern era. When he drove by in his new air-conditioned pickup, he no longer smirked at Earl. He gave a friendly, slightly condescending wave, the kind a king gives to a peasant. Earl had good years, too. The high prices meant his modest harvests brought in more money than he'd ever seen. The farm was already paid for, had been for a generation. His input costs were low, since he did his own repairs and wasn't paying for new equipment. The profits piled up. But while his neighbors were using that windfall as down payments on more land and bigger machines, Earl did something that was, in their eyes, utterly insane. He took the money and put it in the bank. He didn't buy a new tractor. He didn't even buy a new pickup. He met with the president of the local bank, a man he'd known his whole life, and set up a series of certificates of deposit. Interest rates were climbing, a result of the inflation that was starting to ripple through the economy, and the CDs were paying a respectable 8, then 10, then 12%. "Are you sure about this, Earl?" the banker asked, leaning back in his leather chair. "Rich Peterson was just in here yesterday. We financed a new center pivot irrigation system for him. The man is going to double his yields. You've got a lot of cash here. You could easily leverage this to buy that half section next to you. Old Man Hemlock is looking to sell." "And what's the interest rate on a land loan right now?" Earl asked quietly. "Well, it's up there," the banker admitted, "around 14%. But with land values appreciating 20% a year, you're still coming out way ahead." "Trees don't grow to the sky, Tom," Earl said, signing the papers for another CD. "And debt is a shadow that follows you even on a sunny day." He became a local enigma. People thought he was a miser, or that he'd lost his nerve. They saw him still working on his old equipment, still wearing the same faded overalls, and they assumed the good times had passed him by. They didn't know that his bank account was growing fat, and that his net worth, liquid and unencumbered, was likely higher than that of the high flyers who looked down on him. He was a man out of time, a rock in the middle of a river of easy credit, and the water was rising fast. One cool evening in the fall of 1980, Earl sat on his front porch swing, listening to the crickets and the distant rumble of Rich Peterson's Steiger, working through the night under its powerful lights. Martha came out and handed him a glass of iced tea, settling into the chair beside him. On a small table between them, a transistor radio played softly. A newsman with a grave voice was talking about something happening in Washington. He mentioned the Federal Reserve Chairman, a man named Paul Volcker, and his radical new policy to combat inflation. The newsman used phrases Earl didn't fully understand, like tightening the money supply and prime interest rate. Then he said a number that made Earl stop the swing with his foot. The prime rate, the rate banks charge their best customers, had just hit 20%. Earl looked out across his fields, dark and quiet under the rising moon. They were his. Every clod of dirt, every stalk of corn stubble. He owed nothing on them. But he knew what that number meant. It was a death knell for the men who had built their empires on borrowed money. Rich Peterson wasn't just farming his land, he was farming the bank's land. And the rent was about to come due. The wind picked up, rustling the dry leaves in the giant oak tree in the front yard. It carried a chill that had nothing to do with the coming autumn. It was the chill of a coming storm, a financial hurricane that was about to sweep across the heartland and wash away everything that wasn't anchored in solid ground. And Earl Miller, the man in the dirty overalls, the man with the museum of junk, was anchored in bedrock. The first sign of trouble wasn't a number on a bank statement, but the sky itself. The spring of 1981 came in dry and stayed that way. The sky over the county settled into a pale, hazy blue that held no promise of rain. Day after day, the sun beat down, baking the moisture from the rich black soil until it cracked like old pottery. Corn that should have been knee-high by the 4th of July was barely shin-high, its leaves curling inward during the heat of the day. A desperate botanical prayer for a drink. Earl watched the sky and conserved his resources. He cultivated his fields with the old farmel, the slow, methodical passes kicking up clouds of fine, brown dust. He wasn't trying to aerate the soil. He was creating a dust mulch, a thin, dry blanket to keep what little moisture remained from evaporating. It was an old technique, something his father had taught him during the dry years of the 50s. The younger farmers, with their new minimum tillage practices, just watched their fields bake. Rich Peterson tried to fight the drought with technology and horsepower. His new center pivot irrigation system, the one the banker had been so proud of, drew water from a deep well, hissing and creeping in a giant circle across one of his best quarter sections. But it was a losing battle. The electricity bill to run the massive pump was staggering, and the hot, dry winds stole half the water before it ever touched the ground. On his other fields, he ran the big Steiger Panther day and night, pulling a massive field cultivator, trying to accomplish in one high-speed pass what Earl was doing in 3 slow ones. One sweltering afternoon in late July, Earl was in his shop, grinding a new edge on a set of cultivator shovels, when he saw the service truck from the Agri-King dealership turn into Rich Peterson's long driveway. It was a rare sight. The new machines were supposed to be about uptime, as Stan the salesman had said. An hour later, the truck was still there. Curiosity finally got the better of him. He wiped his hands on a rag, climbed into his old Ford pickup, and drove over. He found Rich standing beside the giant silent Steiger in the middle of a parched field, his arms crossed, his face a mask of frustration. The dealership mechanic, a young man Earl didn't recognize, was lying on a creeper underneath the tractor's articulated joint, his face smudged with grease and confusion. "What's the trouble?" Earl asked, keeping his voice neutral. Rich barely looked at him. He kicked at one of the huge tires. "The damn thing won't move. Put it in gear, nothing happens. Engine runs fine. Just sits here." "Hydraulics?" Earl asked. "That's what he thinks," Rich grumbled, nodding toward the mechanic. "Some kind of electronic solenoid that controls the transmission clutch packs. He says he's never seen one fail before. They don't have one in stock. Have to order it from the factory in Fargo. Might be here in 3 days. Might be a week." Earl walked over and peered under the machine. It was a jungle of hoses, wires and control blocks, a world away from the simple gear and lever mechanics of his own tractors. A small black box, with a wiring harness coming out of it, was bolted to the transmission housing. That was the culprit. "What's a part like that cost?" Earl asked. "He doesn't know for sure," Rich said, his voice tight. "Guesses around $800, plus $200 for the service call, plus whatever the labor is to put it in when it gets here. $1,000, maybe more, to fix a part the size of my fist. And every day it sits here, my corn is burning up." Earl looked from the complex, inert machine to Rich's face, etched with a new kind of worry he hadn't seen before. The bravado was gone. In its place was the dawning horror of a man who was no longer in control, a man completely dependent on a supply chain and a technology he didn't understand. "Well," Earl said after a moment, "hope they get it for you soon." He got back in his truck and drove away. He felt no satisfaction, only a deep, chilling sense of pity. Rich had bought the biggest, most powerful tractor in the county, and it had been brought to its knees by a faulty $50 switch that was buried inside an $800 proprietary module. The cracks in Rich Peterson's empire began to show that winter. The drought had cut his yields in half, but his loan payments remained the same. The price of corn, which had been the foundation of the boom, began to slide as a global recession took hold. Rich was forced to sell off some of his corn reserves at a loss just to make the interest payment on his operating note. At the co-op, his talk of expansion and efficiency was replaced by a grim silence. He looked thinner, his eyes carrying the haunted look of a man who does math in his head while he's trying to sleep. He wasn't the only one. A quiet desperation began to settle over the farming community, a collective holding of breath as they waited to see what the new year would bring. What 1982 brought was the flood. The high interest rates, the Volcker shock that Earl had heard about on the radio, had finally broken the back of inflation. But the cost was a brutal recession. The prime rate hovered in the high teens. Variable rate loans, which had seemed so attractive when money was cheap, were now anchors, pulling farmers under. Land values, the collateral that had secured all that debt, began to plummet. Farmers who had borrowed 80% against land, valued at $3,000 an acre, now owed more than the land was worth. The first foreclosure notice appeared in the county paper in March. It was for a young family on the other side of the county. Everyone at the co-op read it in silence. It felt like the first tremor before an earthquake. By summer, there were 3 more. By the fall, the auction notices were a regular feature, listed next to the church bake sales and high school football scores. The crisis came for Rich Peterson on a cold, grey morning in November. The bank didn't even send a local officer. A junior vice president, a kid in a suit who looked barely old enough to shave, drove out from the regional office in Des Moines. Earl saw the unfamiliar sedan parked in Rich's driveway and knew what it meant. 2 weeks later, the auction bills were posted on telephone poles and in the windows of every business in town. They were printed on stark, fluorescent pink paper that was impossible to ignore. The name Richard Peterson was at the top in big, bold letters. Everything was listed. What a lot on 100 acres of prime farmland, a 1981 Steiger Panther tractor, an International 1460 combine, a full line of tillage and planting equipment, the new ranch-style house, the 2 gleaming steel machine sheds. An entire life, itemized and priced for liquidation. The day of the auction was bitter, with a raw wind that whipped across the harvested fields. It felt like the whole county was there, but the mood was not of a festive sale. It was a wake. Farmers stood in small, quiet groups, their hands shoved in their pockets, their faces grim. They weren't there as bidders. They were there as mourners and as witnesses to a fate that could easily be their own. Rich and his wife stood on the porch of their house, looking like ghosts at their own funeral. His confidence was completely gone, replaced by a hollow-eyed shame. He had believed the experts, played the game by their rules, and it had all led to this. The auctioneer, a man with a booming voice and a practiced, cheerful patter, seemed obscene in the somber atmosphere. His calls of, "Who'll give me 20? Now 25. 25, will you give me 30?" echoed across the yard, a grotesque celebration of one family's ruin. The big-ticket items went first. The Steiger Panther, which Rich had paid over $120,000 for just 2 years earlier, was sold for $35,000 to a syndicate of out-of-state buyers. The Combine, barely 3 years old, went for a similar pittance. The crowd murmured. These weren't realistic prices. This was a fire sale, and the vultures were circling. Earl stood at the back of the crowd, his face unreadable beneath the brim of his cap. He hadn't come to gloat. He had come with the pass books for his certificates of deposit, tucked in the inside pocket of his insulated overalls. Over the last 4 years of high interest, his modest savings had grown into a substantial sum. He was a man with cash in an economy gasping for it. The auctioneer moved on to the land. It was sold in parcels. The newer, leveraged parcels went first, selling for less than half of what Rich had paid for them. Finally, the auctioneer announced the last, most important piece. "All right, folks, now for the home quarter. 160 acres with the house, the barns, the original homestead. A beautiful piece of ground, farmed by the Peterson family for 2 generations. What do we bid to start?" The crowd was silent. This was the heart of it all. The land Rich's father had farmed, the house he'd grown up in. Rich's wife finally broke, turning away with a sob and fleeing back into the house. Rich stood alone, his shoulders slumped in defeat. The auctioneer tried to get a bid. No one moved. The local farmers wouldn't bid against a neighbor's home place. It was an unwritten rule. But the out-of-state buyers, the men in clean boots and expensive jackets, began to confer. They smelled blood. $100,000, one of them called out, an insultingly low bid for a prime farmstead. "I have 100. Who'll give 125? The auctioneer boomed. Before anyone else could speak, a calm, steady voice rose from the back of the crowd. 200,000. Every head turned. It was Earl Miller. He stood there, unassuming as ever, his hands in his pockets. A ripple of shock went through the crowd. The out-of-state buyer looked him up and down, saw the faded overalls and the scuffed boots, and smirked. He assumed it was a sympathy bid from a local that would go nowhere. 210, the buyer called dismissively. 250, Earl said immediately, his voice flat, without a trace of emotion. The buyer's smirk vanished. He conferred with his partners. This wasn't part of the plan. They were here to pick up bargains, not get into a bidding war with a local. 260, the buyer said, his voice hesitant. 300,000, Earl replied, his gaze fixed on the auctioneer. He hadn't even looked at the buyer. He was stating a fact, not making a bid. The yard was dead silent, except for the whistling wind. The out-of-state buyers huddled, then one of them shook his head. They were out. $300,000, the auctioneer cried, his professional enthusiasm returning. Do I hear 310? 300,000 once. 300,000 twice, sold for $300,000 to Mr. Earl Miller. The auctioneer's gavel cracked like a rifle shot. A collective sigh of relief went through the local farmers. The home place was safe. Rich Peterson just stared at Earl, his face a mixture of disbelief, confusion, and a dawning, painful flicker of hope. Earl didn't stop there. The big machinery had sold cheap, but the smaller, older items were being practically given away. He bought Rich's well-maintained John Deere 4430 tractor, a solid machine from the mid-70s. He bought a good 6-row planter and a disc. When the auctioneer moved to the contents of the machine shop, Earl bought the heavy-duty welder and the large air compressor. He wasn't just buying assets, he was salvaging the essential tools of a life's work. By the time the auction was over, the bank had recouped most of its money on the land, and Earl Miller was the owner of the Peterson homestead and a shed full of good, used equipment, all purchased for cash at less than half its real value. He had spent a lifetime saving for a rainy day, and a hurricane had arrived. After the crowd had dispersed and the auctioneers were packing up, Earl walked across the yard to where Rich was standing alone, looking out at the fields that were no longer his. The setting sun broke through the clouds for the first time all day, casting long, mournful shadows. "Earl," Rich said, his voice cracking. I don't know what to say." "Why?" Earl stopped beside him and looked out at the same view. "My father always told me that the land remembers," he said quietly. "This land remembers your father and his father before him. It shouldn't belong to a bank in Des Moines or some lawyer from Chicago." "But I can't pay you back," Rich whispered, the shame returning. "I've got nothing left." "I'm not asking you to," Earl said. He turned to face him. "I've got a proposition for you. I'm an old man. I can't farm my ground, and this ground too. I need a good man to run this place. A man who knows this soil better than anyone. I'll pay you a fair wage, and you and your family can stay in the house. You'll work for me. We'll work together." Rich stared at him, his eyes filling with tears. "You'd do that? After how I treated you? After all the times I thought you were just a crazy old relic." "The way I see it," Earl said, a rare, small smile touching his lips, "this farm needs you, and you need this farm. As for the rest of it, that's just water under the bridge. We've got work to do. Spring planting will be here before you know it." He held out a calloused, grease-stained hand. After a long moment, Rich took it, his grip firm. It wasn't the handshake of a boss and a hired hand. It was the handshake of two survivors. The story of Earl Miller's actions at the Peterson auction became a local legend. He was no longer the eccentric old miser. He was the man who had stood up to the outsiders, the man who had saved a neighbor. Farmers started stopping by his workshop again, not to gossip, but to ask for help. A bearing had gone out on an old baler. A hydraulic pump was failing on a 20-year-old tractor. Earl, with his knowledge and his well-equipped shop, became the unofficial heart of the community's effort to survive. He never charged for his labor, just the cost of the parts he had to buy, or the steel he had to use. He was investing in his neighbors, strengthening the whole community, one repair at a time. He and Rich became an unlikely but effective team. Earl's methodical, debt-free approach combined with Rich's knowledge of modern farming techniques. They used Earl's old, reliable equipment alongside the newer, more efficient machines he'd bought at the auction. They prospered, slowly and carefully, through the rest of the lean years of the 80s. 5 years after the auction, Earl made Rich another offer. He sold the Peterson homestead back to him for exactly what he had paid for it, with a private loan at a fair interest rate. He wasn't a landlord. He was a banker, the kind of banker the world had forgotten, one who invested in people, not just balance sheets. One warm summer evening, years later, Earl was in his shop. He was nearly 70 now, his movements slower, his hair white, but his hands were as steady as ever. His grandson, A boy of about 10 stood on a stool beside him at the workbench. Earl was showing him how to disassemble and clean a carburetor from an old lawnmower engine. "See here," Earl said, pointing with the tip of a screwdriver. "This little jet gets clogged with dirt and old gas. The whole machine stops working, all because of a tiny little piece you can barely see. You don't throw away the whole mower. You find the problem, and you fix it." The boy listened intently, his face serious with concentration. Through the open shop doors, they could see the fields stretching out under a golden sunset. The corn was tall and green, the leaves rustling in the gentle breeze. Across the road, on the Peterson place, the lights of a tractor moved steadily across a field, its engine a low, contented hum in the twilight. It was Rich, finishing his planting. "Grandpa?" the boy asked, looking up from the carburetor. "Mum says you're the richest man in the county. Are we?" Earl stopped his work and looked down at his grandson. He looked at his own hands, the nails permanently rimmed with black, the knuckles swollen with arthritis, the skin a road map of 100 cuts and burns. He thought of the money in the bank, the deeds to the land he owned free and clear, the respect of his neighbors. He thought of the simple, profound satisfaction of a machine brought back to life, of a crop safely in the bin, of a family and a community made whole again. He put his arm around the boy's shoulders and pulled him close, the smell of gasoline and clean steel filling the air. "We're not rich because of what we have in the bank, son," he said, his voice soft. "We're rich because of what we don't owe. We're rich because when something breaks, we know how to fix it. And we're rich because we understand the difference between the price of something and its real value." He looked out the door one last time, at the land that had sustained his family for a century. The sun had dipped below the horizon, but the sky still glowed with a deep, peaceful light. He was just a man in dirty overalls, a man who had been dismissed and ignored, but he had held fast to the old ways, and in the end he had not only saved himself, but he had become the bedrock upon which others could rebuild, and that, he knew, was the only kind of wealth that truly mattered.